So there were some of the questions which Glenn and everybody already asked, which I wanted to ask as part of the conversation, but I'll get to that. Shameless pitch. If you have not joined Pivotal Atlanta meetup, please join. We have an upcoming meetup coming on Cloud Native Build Packs, which is a CNCF project. If you guys have not looked at it, go look at it. It's about building your containers from your code, driving through your builders of Java or other technologies which you want to use. It's next week in Avalon, and yeah, please feel free to join and come over. So when I was doing this, putting this presentation together, my thought was like, what exactly I'm trying to do with this, right? And I thought there's no hard and fast rules around this, right? There's no, you cannot say that this is better versus that is better when you're using microservice and you're trying to do service discovery and reliability on Kubernetes and you're especially Java developer and using Spring. Should I use Spring Cloud or should I use native Kubernetes? And what does that mean to me when I'm using either of those? And what I thought is, I'm going to keep it more conversational. And essentially, in fact, I'm using this presentation and this talk to learn what's the thought process of everybody out here, right? When you are in this scenario, when you are doing microservices, using Java, using probably Spring or Spring Cloud, and you're deploying your stuff on Kubernetes, what are you doing? Are you moving off Spring Cloud? Are you using native K8s? And we kind of get into some of those things in our conversations. Just to introduce me, I'm a platform architect with Pivotal. I'm a Googler because I do everything through Google. My Twitter is Mayure Krishna and GitHub is Mayure Krishna. Blog, I really like that domain name, so I kept it. I don't have anything over there. But it's really hard to remember my name, so I ask everybody to call me MK so that you can remember it. So next time you don't have to pronounce the name. If I come across somewhere, you can just remember me as MK and say hi, right? It's easy. Spring Boot. So agenda, I have like, 56 slides around these things. I want to talk about microservices, service discovery, configuration management, circuit breaker, Spring Cloud services, native Kubernetes constructs around it, and what to do in what scenario. So coming back to some of the questions which Glenn and Pratik already asked, how many of you are using Spring right now? Spring Boot, Spring Cloud. Let's start with Spring Boot. Are you using Spring Boot right now? Are you doing microservices right now? And are you using Spring Cloud right now? Some of you? Okay. And how many of you are using Kubernetes right now with your microservices? So I thought you were there, a few of you were there. Are you guys using Spring at all with Kubernetes?
Ours is limited. We're doing actually a lot of Node.
Okay. Good. So what I wanted to understand is like how much we have from Spring users' point of view. Are you guys, anybody over here is using other than Java or Java projects or Java-based projects, something else, right? I mean, like Node, or for example, for that matter, anything like Ruby or Go or some other language framework. Are you guys using any of those? Node and Python? Yeah. So. Okay. And are you deploying your apps to Kubernetes with Node or Python? Are you deploying your apps to Kubernetes with Node or Python, or your Python applications to Kubernetes?
No, just
Okay. So let's get through this, right? What I decided is like I'm not going to go through this whole 56 slides. What I'll try to do is get into some of the constructs of service discovery, reliability, and config management. Touch a little bit upon Spring Cloud and how Spring Cloud solves that, and I want to keep it to a level where if you know nothing about it, you can still get some idea, and if you know everything about it, then I won't spend a lot of time on it, and you won't get bored, right? So let's get started. I don't want to talk about why microservices. I think everybody, there has been a lot of talks on why microservices since the last 5 years, I guess, right? But we have some challenges. I'm sure everybody has seen some of those challenges, talked through those challenges, and faced those challenges. What I'm going to touch upon is the configuration management, registration, and discovery, and fault tolerance. Why that? Because configuration management, especially with containers, especially with microservices, gets hard, right? How do you manage it, right? The idea of microservices is that you want to break it out and go towards more domain-driven design and have smaller chunks. And with that, your configuration management also becomes a challenge, a hell for developers to manage configuration across like multiple services, being able to change those in production without going through the entire deployment process. So it becomes really challenging. And that's where also your registration and discovery comes in. When you're deploying your apps to your, as containers or microservices, now you have multiple different endpoints to go to. So how do I kind of keep up with all these different changing endpoints in the configuration files, which now instead of 3 or 4 configuration files now have like 100 configuration files, or maybe if you have 20, 30 apps, you have 30 configuration files to manage across the environments. So how do you go about it? So kind of a quick idea about what these 3 means, right? And giving you a kind of background on these. Anybody over here already know these 3 concepts: service discovery, configuration management, and fault tolerance with Spring? Are you guys using any of the Spring Cloud Discovery or Spring Cloud Netflix projects right now? Okay. You using it in production? Awesome. So this is just a highlight of what these 3 means, and I'll try to explain what the idea of service discovery is. That when I'm deploying my backend apps as probably a front-end app or an app which is using this, or app which is consuming this particular backend app, doesn't need to have the static load balancer URI in its call, right? You want a way that if this app changes its URIs, its load balancer, or even its instances, I can keep on using that service through some kind of a service discovery, and I don't have to go through a change of configuration. I don't have to go through a change of, or go through a deployment when something happens or changes on the backend, right? I have some kind of a registration available as a consumer of that service. I can go to this service registry, go fetch that, okay, this backend API or microservice, what's that endpoint? I can go and get to it, and I can use that endpoint to call my actual API. That's the whole idea of service discovery, that you can have some kind of a dynamic way of finding the address of the APIs you're trying to get to, or apps you're trying to get to. Any questions on that? Configuration management. The idea of configuration management is to take kind of similar concept of having one place as an address to go to and find information. The idea of configuration management is, even though we're trying to decentralize the microservices, let's centralize the configuration management to a location where it becomes manageable, right? So let's have some kind of a repository where I can store my configuration file and track my configuration file and change my configuration files and inject those changes dynamically to the services which is running in the production, right? And you can have the life cycle around it, that how would you go through the approval process of managing those changes. But this enables you to view your multi-microservices configurations in one place and change it accordingly. And then you can split it accordingly as per your services. But this gives you a much more easier way to manage your multiple configuration files. Instead of managing it along with the app individually, now you can manage it in a central Git repository or or other versioning products. So Spring Cloud config management, which can integrate with Git, it can integrate with a couple of other, it can integrate with, I guess, Vault and a couple of other things. So it gives you a good way to manage your configuration through that centralized location. And then reliability and fault tolerance that's also the Netflix project, which became open source, and then Spring Cloud took over. The idea of reliability and fault tolerance is when you are making calls to your backend applications or APIs, and you have latency or you have some other reasons because of which you're not able to reach to your backend service, you still have a way to respond back to your consumers in a better way, in a good way, instead of sending back like huge stack trace or just an error message, right? So you have some kind of a controlled response to your consumers when something wrong happens to the backend apps or backend APIs or backend systems, right? And what this project gives is a way to automatically trip that breaker, like the backend apps are not working or there's latency, it trips the circuit. You're no longer going to the backend service, you're responding back with some kind of a fallback mechanism. And it also automatically opens or like closes the circuit once in a while. Like there's a configuration for that setting, that how often you want to go back and close the circuit, and checks if, and you call it as partial close or half open. It checks whether the backend is healthy now. If it is healthy, it will completely close the circuit and let everything go back to normal. If when it is half closed or half open, if backend is still not healthy, it will go back to your fallback mechanism. So it gives you a really good way to fall back on your backend errors or backend issues, so that your front end is still responding, or your consuming applications are still responding with a good message or a good way, instead of throwing back exceptions. So those are some of the discovery, reliability, and configuration concepts, which is really great in Spring Cloud. And if you're already using Spring Boot, you can enable these, integrate these very easily. I'll go through an example of that as a next step. And I mean, the question I wanted to ask, which you already asked, was that if you're using Java, Spring, or Spring Boot, Spring Cloud helps you to add discovery and reliability very easily. And I'll quickly show you that, which includes, it also includes Spring Cloud Gateway and tracing. You can add those as well. But today we'll touch upon config, discovery, and breaker. So, what I have in my example is I have created a backend API called reservation service, and there's a client app which is just a simple UI, and it's a reservation UI. And to enable and this is a Spring Boot app which has Spring Cloud included in it. To enable circuit breaker, config management, and as well as Spring Cloud discovery, all I had to do was add these starters, right? I added the Spring Cloud circuit breaker starter, Spring Cloud config client, and a Spring Cloud service registry, right? And other than that, when I've added these dependencies, all I have to do to enable as a client these things is, in my application, I say I want to enable my circuit breaker, and I want to enable discovery client. So these are the only two annotations I added. Now, if I have the service discovery piece running, or the server running, this application would be able to talk to it, right? And you have to provide it the URL of your service discovery server, the Eureka server. But other than that, this annotation itself will now will enable it to talk to your service registry, fetch the information about the backend APIs you're pushing over there, and then use that as your endpoint. And to do that, all I had to do was, and I'm using so basically from this UI app, I'm making a call to my REST service, which is the reservation service application. And that service is, all I am calling that service is, or the endpoint I'm using for that service is reservation service. And that's the name of the app. So in this reservation service is defined as reservation service. So all I'm doing is calling that name, and I don't have to know what URL it is living on, right? Service registry is going to provide me what's the actual endpoint of this service. I don't have to go figure out and put it in configuration. I mean, you can put the name itself in the configuration, but other than that, I don't need to know the backend servers. I don't need to know the load balancers. All I need to know is what's the alias of that service from service registry point of view, and I can call that out.
But where are you going here to the service registry? Where is that defined?
So you'll define that in your application.properties. So in my case, so if you don't define it either, it will go to the local host, and I think service registry runs on the port 3667, but I'll have to confirm. But if in this scenario, I'm going to deploy this where my service registry is already running, and it will automatically connect to it. And that's one of the piece of where I'm deploying it. I'm going to push this particular application right now to Cloud Foundry, and that automatically connects to the service discovery or my service registry server, because I'm going to bind this application to that particular service registry. But essentially, you will be defining your Eureka server URL over here.
So is that protocol standardized to talk to the service discovery?
Yeah. So if you are so wherever you do, so in this case I've deployed my service registry in Cloud Foundry. If you are running it standalone, or if you're running it in Kubernetes, you have to just define that in the URL over here, right? And then you manage that through your configuration file, and then we'll get into some of the configuration file pieces as well. But what I'm going to show you is when I deploy this app and I bind this application to the service registry service. Let me bring that up quickly. Let me delete these. I have these three services running: service registry, config server, and a circuit breaker. You can run it locally and connect to it through your application.properties locally, or you can run it on any servers, right? What this gives is this is the server piece of it, which is going to store the information of your application URI, right? It's going to keep the registration of your application URI. So if I go here and look at the endpoint, so it gives you this view which shows where some of these things are running, right? It gives you what apps are registered to it and where it is running, what's the status of it, is up or not. So that's what the server side of it is going to give you. So if you run this service registry server, you will be able to get to it like this. So going back to the app, so this app is talking to, let me talk about one more thing in here. So this app, in this app also have the circuit breaker. So I had that enabled over here. And after enabling the circuit breaker, I have to define some kind of fallback mechanism, right? And what I'm trying to do over here is that if this call out, so for this particular method, if the call out to my backend service fails or it has some latency, let's have a fallback method, right? And fallback reservation is my fallback method. And in that fallback method, all I'm doing is right now either getting my fallback information from my configuration, or if my configuration server is not even available, then just do a fallback name. So this fallback mechanism can be something which you can define based on your business scenario, that what you want to return to your end users when your backend system is not available, right? You want to go pull it from some configuration, some value. You can have some kind of a separate line of logic to go call out when this fallback happens. But the idea is that it will call that fallback when this particular service has a problem, this backend call has a problem. And there are more properties to Hystrix command which you can add. Like you can add properties around, you want to add not just on the failures, but you also want to add some on latency. So you can add those properties in your application or properties to say, if your latency is above this value, then go to fallback. So you can add those properties to your fallback mechanism. And the third thing which I'm using in this is that I'm using configuration to pull that fallback value, right? So in this case, I'm trying to get a set of fallback name, and I'm trying to get that from my configuration. And that configuration lives on my config server, right? And my config server is also deployed over here. So I have the config server deployed, service registry deployed, service registry server, and circuit breaker in this case is just a UI to show you the status of your applications. That's the Netflix UI, which you would have seen in some of the examples from Netflix. That
Who's uploading configuration data to the config server?
Sure. When you deploy a config server, you define where your configuration is, right? So let's go back here. Whether you're deploying it over here or you're deploying it yourself, you define where my configuration is going to live. So if I go here and look at it, come on. This is where my configuration lives. And you can have multiple. You can add as many configuration files to it.
A direct one-to-one relationship to your source code control, or can you say, run through this script so it can massage the data before I upload it?
So the way this works is my application.properties, you can define by your application and have the application.properties value of that config here. And you can have multiple of those. And your Spring Boot specifically will pick up your specific application.properties from there, right? So if I have reservation-service as my application, I can have this as my reservation-service application.properties file over there, and it will pick up the application.properties from there.
I have the same reservation.properties for production, staging.
Right, so that's your profile, right? So you would have all the profiles over there, right? So when you're running the application, you would use that profile when you're deploying this application, right? So and it will pull that profile and that particular properties from the profile. What typically you would do is you would use your, and the way I've seen config server being used is the production config server has the production configuration files. And then non-production has all the non-production config servers on a completely different config server. And it's kind of managed from there. So, and if I go here.
You mentioned about the observer. Is that like your own code that can do whatever it needs to do to return data back?
The fallback method?
No. You said there is an observer that you can tie into the config server.
Right, so this the circuit breaker is the observer, which is going to give you the information about what's the status of the application.
Right.
What if the application circuit is open or closed?
Right. Circuit breaker is one side, but is there a circuit breaker for the configuration server as well? It says if I can't reach the real config server, or always go through this endpoint because I now have to massage some data for whatever reason. I understand the profiles
Sure.
work, Spring profiles do work.
Right.
But sometimes if you want to really massage because I have a different lookup for a different purpose.
Sure. So you would add that in your code, right? The logic of this is my config. So in this method, you can go and say I'm going to look that up, and I'm doing that something similar to that right now here, right? If my config server is not available, then I'm just setting it to no config server, right? You can have your own logic over here. You can make this go to a method where it says when config server is not available, do something else. Do the pull that information from somewhere else, or have a static value, right? When you want to massage that data, then you would pull that configuration information. Right now, I'm directly pulling the config from reservation prefix, and if it has a fallback name, it will pick it up. I can choose to just pull that configuration data and then do whatever massaging on it, right? And then set variables based on that massaging, right? So if you have to make changes to your data which you're pulling out, this configuration is just going to pull that data out. Once you have the data pulled out, and in Spring Boot, you can just pull that data out through @value from configuration file, the @value annotation, and then just use it. Good.
Yeah. Can you say something about what this makes sense when you're deployed into Kubernetes, right? You're kind of showing this complete stack that's handling these features. If you're deployed into Kubernetes, the K8s, some of this functionality is already covered by core behaviors in K8s.
Absolutely.
So
That's the exact. So that's the exact conversation I'm trying to get to through this, right? So the next step is once I get through this, the discussion is about Kubernetes already provides you those constructs like natively. So on the service side, all I'm doing over there is, let me see. Yeah, I've enabled my discovery client over here as well, so that this backend API also registers to service registry. So if I need to enable service discovery on both the sides, so that both are talking to the service registry server and registering themselves, right? So and all I had to do was add those dependencies in my POM for Spring Cloud Services, config client, service registry. I'm not using circuit breaker over here, so I did not even add that. So all I have to do is that and this annotation. And this app will now be able to register to the service registry. So if your service, as I said, if your service registry is not deployed on PCF, you would add that URL to your application.properties, and you would just use that and manage your endpoint to the service registry through that. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and deploy these. Oh, let's get bigger. This is just a manifest for my app getting deployed on PCF. I'm saying that I'm going to use these 3 services. So attach my app to that. I'm going to CF push this, as well as this. Both the apps got bound to that service. Let's see. Yeah, so if I go to my registry now, I should be able to see both of those registered over here. All right. So reservation service is up. Should be able to get that data back. Okay. So this is the backend service, and I'm getting that data back from backend service, and my UI should be able to get that data back as well. All right. Did I enable it? The circuit is closed. Run. So for some reason, it's going to the fallback, and it's fetching that information from the configuration over here. And let me see why. Symbol true. Yeah, for some reason the UI is not registering over here. Let me do a see if push on it again. So one part of it, which it did it from a demo goof up, is that it went to the fallback method, right? So it was not able to find the reservation service. This app was not able to register to the service registry. So it took the fallback route, and from the fallback route, it was able to fetch configuration from my config file and just display age of meet of a school, instead of fetching the actual data, which is here from the backend reservation service. This is the actual data which it should be pulling. Let's see if it comes back this time around and registers. So it's registry. Yeah. Now it's up, so it should be able to go to the actual backend. Yeah. Okay. So it went to the actual backend and pulled it now. So yeah. So I was going to do the next part as like deleting the reservation service and showing you that it can pull from config and from fallback method, but yeah, it happened other way around. All right. So this gives you a way to talk to your back. So in this case, now I can, if I go and deploy this service, change my URI and say it's no longer reservation service anymore, it's reservation service 2, right? And make that change and push this application. The UI app, for the UI app, I don't have to make any changes because the UI app is calling out to the service registry, pulling the current endpoint from their registry and then calling it out. So you don't have to make changes to your consumers, your client apps don't have to make changes when your backend endpoints are changing, or even if you go and deploy it somewhere else altogether. If you're moving from, say, VMs to containers and deploying on Kubernetes, you don't have to, and if you're already using Spring Cloud, you don't have to ask your consumers to go change anything because it is going to register to the same service registry where your consumers are already going and talking to. So in this case, let's see. So we should see this in our service registry, that change of endpoint. All right, this is back up. If I go here. And yeah, let me also remove that endpoint because I think it's still attached. Okay. Let me remove this. So that endpoint is no longer available. This should pick up the new one soon. Okay, for some reason it's not picking up. So these renewal settings is something which you can put on the service registry and say how often you want to renew the endpoints. Right now it's not renewing quick enough. Yeah, let me do this.
Isn't like a 5-minute thing with scripts?
It's not really with Hystrix, it's the service registry configuration that how often you want to go and ping and get the new or update your registry information. So what I'll do is I'll just delete it so that it completely removes it and then brings it back. So no, this one. There, change it to yeah, it's taking time to renew it. So what I'll do is I'll let it renew and see when it renews back, but we'll go on to the next piece of it, right? Is what if, as you were saying, if you use Kubernetes, then what do you do, right? Kubernetes already has the construct of services, which does the service registry for you, right? You have your Kubernetes service doing your DNS with your pods. You don't have to worry about where the pods are living. And you can just hit the services endpoint. It's the exact same concept which service registry is trying to do, and Spring Cloud Service Discovery is trying to do with your own deployed service registry. Kubernetes gives you that thing out of the box, right? You can just point your application to services, and it will go and use it. And I mean, I can deploy the same app, just point it to the Kubernetes service, and I don't have to define anything else anywhere. I don't have to refer to a service registry or anything. I can just go there, right? Same thing for configuration. Kubernetes provides config map for managing your configuration. I don't have to have a configuration server, but you can just use config map to manage your configurations, right? In case of circuit breaker, this is something which is not out of the box, like it's not native to Kubernetes, but you can deploy on the proxy and use ST or some other service mesh kind of concept to have the circuit breaker in your application, right? So if your backend application is down, your Envoy proxy policy can say that instead of going to this backend service, respond this, or go to a different service and respond from there, right? So with Kubernetes, Kubernetes gives you a lot of these out of the box and gives you the ability to do some of these within Kubernetes natively. Now, and I mean, I can quickly demo that part of it. That in Kubernetes, when you deploy this app, in case of reservation UI, I'm going to deploy the reservation service, and all I'm going to do is, where is my call out? Yeah, here. All I'm going to do is change this to my Kubernetes service URI. So all I'm doing is I'm still calling it out as reservation service 8080. That's my endpoint and port. In case of when you deploy it in production, you'll have a secure URL, so you can just give that URL of the service, right? Or I mean, in case of internal services, you can just use the service endpoint, right? So it gives you the exact same experience which you're getting with service registry, that you are no longer calling the backend API or backend application through their specific endpoints. You're just calling it through their registered service name. And so if I just go and deploy this, let me remove this. And I want to disable my Eureka clients, because I no longer need Eureka clients for talking to Kubernetes. And that's it. Let me recompile the other one as well. Here's a neat way using the CNCF Cloud Native build packs. I can build my image and push my image to my repository, using Pack, which is the Cloud Native Foundation Cloud Native Build Packs project, and this is a sneak peek of what we'll be talking about in the next meetup and with the Cloud Native Build Packs. So essentially, what it does is it detects what kind of app it is, and then I have the Cloud Native Build Pack builders. So it will choose the Java builder and then create the image out of it. And you can define your builders with your configurations in it. That you want, what kind of OS you want, what kind of JDK you want, and use that builder for your application. So yeah, let's just push my application to my repository. So if I go to I should see it here. Last push a few seconds ago. So now I'll just go ahead and deploy this. Same, but let me kick this off as well.
What exactly is Pack doing?
Pack is building the, I don't need to define my Docker file. Pack is building the container for me based on the Pack's builder configuration. So as a team, I can define my configuration for all the applications through Pack builders, and then all the devs, all they have to do is, or in my CI/CD pipeline, all I have to do is call the Pack CLI and call out with that builder configuration, and it will build the image for me and push it to the repository or registry.
So what builder configuration is like what type of OS?
Right. Yeah. So
Replacing your Docker file.
it's replacing your doc. So you define it in one place, and then everybody who is developing can use that configuration and build their images instead of everybody defining their own Docker file or copying Docker files around. And there are more things in Pack which you can do. You can update layers of your image without actually rebuilding your image, which helps in, like, if you want to do just OS patching, how would you go about doing that? So it does a symlink of image layers instead of actually doing the image layers. So there's some good information around how Pack is used, and like if you guys want to come around next week on the Pack meetup, we'll go a little bit on that and see what it can do. All right, let me see if I have things already running on my Kubernetes. Okay. I have, let me delete it. So in this scenario, my service is living over here in Kubernetes as a reservation service. So I can directly access the service with this URL. I don't have to now use service registry or for that matter, Spring Cloud project to talk to Kubernetes with these constructs, right? In case of Kubernetes, other than the folks who are already using Kubernetes, do you know some of the basic constructs of Kubernetes, the services, the pods, and the containers within the pods? So it's just using the native Kubernetes constructs to do the same thing which I was doing on some on PCF outside of Kubernetes, right? So I'm just using my reservation service as my endpoint in my app now to talk to my backend service, right? And I just call that out. I don't have to call the IP address or the load balancer URI of that application. So I can just go here. Oh, it's still pending. So let me see. Let's see if that got resolved or not. Yeah, so it refreshed at some point. It's this one is deployed on Azure, so it's just waiting to get the load balancer or IP address from Azure. So I think it gets done in like a few seconds or 15 seconds or something like that. Oh, 2 minutes, 120 seconds. So while that happens, yeah, here you go. So now I can access that UI. 81. Yeah. Oh, sorry, my bad. I was still looking at the internal IP address. So while that comes up, let me go back to this part, right? That what should I use, right? I mean, this is a question where it's something which I would like to ask you guys. What would you choose to use in this scenario, right? And I say is that what's your lowest common denominator? What's your lowest common denominator, and that should drive what you should be using. So like in this scenario, 7 is my lowest common denominator. If I'm using Java Spring with VMs, Java Spring with Cloud Foundry, Java Spring is my lowest common denominator, right? In that case, Spring Cloud makes really good sense, right? You can use Spring Cloud to enable some of those things which Kubernetes provides you out of the box. If you're using all the different kinds of language frameworks with Kubernetes, then your common denominator is K8s, right? In that case, it makes sense to use probably K8s construct, right? Use the Kubernetes service, use the Kubernetes config maps to drive your configuration. You can choose to use in this scenario, you can choose to use probably circuit breaker from Spring Cloud. If you don't want to deploy Envoy proxy or something like something similar in service mesh side to manage your circuit breaker concept. But other than that, the service discovery and configuration comes out of the box. So I would say when your common denominator is Kubernetes and you're not primarily a Spring or Java developers, and you have polyglot applications across the board, then it makes sense to use Kubernetes constructs, right? Even if probably in Spring project you're already using Spring Boot, but you have that polyglot, so use K8s in that scenario. But what if you have Java Spring and with K8s, so you also have Java Spring on VMs, you have Java Spring on Cloud Foundry? What would you do in that scenario? I think that's the most, discussion point, or you can say that's the most difficult scenario where you have to decide what should I do, especially if you're already using Spring or Spring Boot, or to some extent Spring Cloud, and if you are now moving to Kubernetes, what should you do? Should you just throw away what you've done so far and use Kubernetes constructs, or should you just port over whatever you're using, whatever you were doing in Spring Cloud and service registry, and just deploy it on Kubernetes? Get a service registry server and a circuit breaker server and a config server up and running on Kubernetes and just connect to it. So that's and I don't really have any. What I would say is it's completely upon you, right? How you would choose to go either or R. What I would say is if you are primarily Spring and Java shop, if your developers are comfortable with Spring and Java, then it makes sense to keep using Spring Cloud, right? Whether you go on Kubernetes or you go somewhere else, right? You use Docker Enterprise, you can still use Spring Cloud, and it helps over there. What I would add to that is Spring Cloud has a project called Spring Cloud Kubernetes. And what Spring Cloud Kubernetes does for you is if you're already using Spring Cloud service registry constructs, if you're already using circuit breaker constructs in your application, then all you need to do is add the Spring Cloud Kubernetes starter in your dependency and disable, as I was disabling my circuit breaker, my config server, as well as my Eureka clients. You disable that, you enable Spring Cloud Kubernetes, and Spring Cloud project, Kubernetes project, now uses internally the constructs of config map and the constructs of services instead of using service registry, right? So you're not changing your code. If you're already using Spring Cloud services, you don't have to go back and change your code. You can keep using the same code, and Spring Cloud Kubernetes project will bind to Kubernetes service itself or Kubernetes config map itself instead of going and looking for service registry server or looking for service config server, right? So instead of that, we'll just directly bind to Kubernetes constructs. So that's one of the direction, and we're working with a couple of clients where they were already using Spring Cloud services, and they were already doing service discovery and registry through Spring Cloud projects, and they're moving to Kubernetes, and this is the direction they're all trying to go towards. They are leaning towards not changing the whole lot of code before going to Kubernetes, just using the Spring Cloud Kubernetes constructs and utilizing the native Kubernetes underlying constructs through Spring Cloud project, right? So change of code is not required. You just add the dependency, disable your config, disable your service discovery client, and just use Spring Cloud. So let me see if this is back up. Yeah, I have an external IP now. Log one. So I can go and 81. That'll work. Oh, I need to push on data. Sorry. It's going to the backend and there's no data, so it's not bringing back anything. So, now I should see some data over here. Yeah. So as I said, in case of Kubernetes, I was able to use the same service construct, but you can, if you are already using Spring and if you're already using Spring Cloud, then it makes a lot of sense to use Spring Cloud Kubernetes project so that you don't have to go through all of code changes. You can just add your dependencies and still use the Kubernetes constructs. Yeah, that's all I had. So these are the two meetups which are coming up. One on the build packs, and the other one would be I'll get into the details of Spring Cloud Kubernetes and how you can switch from this. For example, in this project, we have been using Spring Cloud services. How do I add the dependency of Spring Cloud Kubernetes and what code I have to change to start using it on Kubernetes, and just use the Kubernetes construct. So yeah, look out for the next one on Meetup. That's it. I don't.
Got about 5 minutes for questions. Any
Sure.
questions? Well, you have first, then you're next, okay?
Go ahead.
Hey, what's the minimum version of Spring you need to be on to use Spring Cloud Kubernetes?
I'll have to check. Let me see. Are you saying minimum version of Spring for Kubernetes? Let's see. Does it say?
Click learn. Go back up. You're right.
Yeah, let me see.
So you can
Very clear.
Avalon, sir? Is it in Avalon Alfredo?
Yeah. I'll check on that and get back to you. What's the dependency chain? Like what's Spring Boot? And you're saying Spring Framework or Spring Boot?
Spring Boot is going to be
Should be
2.10 and above.
Yeah. But I can confirm.
It's not a 1.5 line. Sorry. What's next?
So it's shame to say, but we are using the Spring Framework still.
Right.
But it's a monolithic. But I want to try to apply the Microservice architect. But then, two options, moving to AWS and still working on our private data center. Then
Right.
what's the simplest way actually shorten the developer time to actually learning the daily, moving to Microservice stack? What's your opinion?
I think it's I don't think so. It's a the question is
It's a monolithic application with the Spring Framework. Running on still the data center, not a private data center.
right.
And the two option is like, I want to apply the Microsoft architect, but learning one option is running on data center.
Right.
Then I have to maybe install the Kubernetes, and then learning on AWS. Second option, and then what should let's say like only we have a 6 months. Then what's the direction?
Or you're going to be using Kubernetes, or you're going to be, it's just a platform, right? You don't know what platform you're going to go to, or it's going to be AWS, or
Yeah, AWS only
you're going to be in
AWS.
Spring Cloud.
Spring Cloud, okay.
Right. So what I generally say in that scenario is that at least choose a common construct, like that lowest common denominator. So if you're gonna stick to, say, if you want to deploy it as containers, break it down and use Kubernetes, then use that as your construct on both AWS and on-prem. If you're gonna use, don't do that. You're gonna still use VMs over here and you're gonna use containers over there, or vice versa. It will be easier that you build that common construct and then have your developers learn through how to go about it, right? Learning Spring, from Spring to Spring Boot is pretty easy. From Spring Framework to going to Spring Boot is more of like, I need to unlearn all the things which I was doing and just go to Spring Boot, right? And just do a startup, right? So going to Spring Boot is actually like giving away a lot of baggage which you were carrying with Java days, right? Not to say that Spring Framework, in the background, Spring Framework does a lot of things. Yeah, so.
Pre-configured stuff.
Yeah.
What about the Spring Boot versus Spring Cloud?
Right, so Spring Cloud.
Okay, I thought it was talking about Kubernetes, but Spring Cloud it sits on top of Spring Boot. Spring Boot is for app development. Spring Cloud is when you have to start thinking of microservices.
Okay.
And so if I'm writing just apps,
I
it will
see.
be for Spring Boot. But if I'm thinking about like, okay, this boot app needs to be a microservice that fits in the microservice framework, then you're going to
Yeah,
switch
sure.
to use Spring Cloud.
Right.
Other questions?
What do you think about the security level between?
No, she doesn't want it.
Yeah, I don't know.
No, it's okay. She can ask. We'll repeat it.
What do you think about the security level between the Kubernetes and Spring?
So the question is, what I think about the security level in Spring Cloud and Spring and Kubernetes. I think both are like two different constructs in terms of security, right? Spring Cloud will deal with more of your app-specific security, right? Kubernetes deals with more of your how you're deploying and how you're managing your basically infrastructure security. So whether you use Spring Cloud or not, you would still have to apply the Kubernetes security constructs, or whether you use Kubernetes or not, for your application, you still have to apply the application security construct, right? So with not necessarily with Spring Cloud, with Spring Boot, you could use the Spring Security and use those constructs for your application security. Spring Security integrates really well with OIDC providers, which you want to add to your application. And then Kubernetes side is more of like, Kubernetes is like a Lego block, right? You can open as much as you want, you can close as much as you want, right? So you have to figure out what's that right mix on Kubernetes, how much you want to open up in terms of your applications, what ports you want to open up, whether you want to open it up to your backend services to your front end load balancer or not. So those are some of the constructs that you would add with Kubernetes. And to add more to Kubernetes is you can go towards looking at service mesh constructs, adding MTLS on all your conversation between pods to pods or load balancer to your pods. You can enable things like your SSL is kind of goes up until the pod, and that's where it gets decrypted so that you have the security end to end. So all of those things is what you will still have to think in Kubernetes outside of your application security. Good.
In the demo, what if I want to add the API gateway between UI and then the backend? Then I don't need the service registry, right?
If you want to add API gateway, sure. Yeah, I mean you can add API gateway to the between your UI and backend, but you have to go maintain your API gateway now, right? When so the whole construct is when your backend endpoints are changing, you don't want to make things change, or you don't want your consumer clients to change, right? In this case, you're not changing your consumer clients, but you still have to go work on your API gateway, right? And API gateway's construct is still important. It especially is important when you want to expose things outside of your network, especially outside to your external world. Say again?
Rate limiting kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you can add those policies when you want to add some of those governance policies around your APIs. It makes sense to still use API gateway. But the API gateway does not solve the service registry and discovery problem. I'm not saying I shouldn't say API gateway doesn't solve it, but the traditional API gateways don't solve it, right? The API gateways, and it is a very contention point for me. The API gateways of now with Kubernetes, you shouldn't be looking at API gateways of the traditional world. You should be looking at things like Envoy proxy and that, for that matter, for API gateways.
Is the config map equivalent to the zookeeper?
Say it again?
The config map, is it something similar to the zookeeper?
Yeah, very similar.
Not
Console and
It's okay.
not quite. There's a difference between the two.
So, what is Zookeeper doing?
Well, I mean, Zookeeper is going to be maintaining, that information, but also maintains the state between multiple apps.
Right.
Well, config map says, okay, here's configurations I want to store. And so they're kind of they do have a kind of a rough coverage, but one is really meant for configurations, config map, while the other's meant for kind of storing state between multiple applications.
Right, so the way I see it is like Zookeeper is more of infrastructure registry, I would say, right? It gives you a way to have that similar alias construct for your infrastructure deployments, right? So, for example, if I'm deploying, say, Kafka nodes and Kafka brokers, I want to have some way to discover those Kafka brokers. So, and Zookeeper works really well in that.